who's a Republican. And in the 24th district, Travis Ballinger is the Democrat running, and Ed Robb is the Republican. Ed Robb, like Mike Ditmore, wasn't able to attend tonight. In the 25th district, it's Democrat Judy Baker and Republican Bob Northrup. And now each candidate will have up to 3 minutes for their introduction, and we'll begin.
Is there a timer?
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Ben Landre here is the timer, and when you have 30 seconds left, he's going to lift the American flag. And when your time is up, Old Glory will start waving, and when that happens, you should finish your sentence. You don't have to stop in mid-sentence, but we don't allow run-on sentences. More than 3 or 4 commas won't be allowed, so stop it as soon as you can at that point. And in your 3-minute introduction, you can say what you want, but we'd appreciate it if you would mention your future vision for Boone County in terms of growth and development and preservation issues somewhere in that introduction. And so I'll begin, and each time a candidate finishes, I'll probably mention their name and then mention who's starting up for the benefit of radio viewers since they can't see the name tags up here. So now this is Chuck Graham.
Thank you, and first of all, I'd like to thank the Smart Growth Coalition for having this forum this evening. It's obviously a very important issue to Boone County as we continue to have about 2% growth a year within this community. There are a lot of issues that we'll talk about tonight, but the first thing I'd like to do is thank the Sierra Club for endorsing me once again in this race. This is the 4th general election that they have endorsed me in, and we've been one of the offices who has made sure that we got their bulletins out to the rest of the members of the General Assembly, helped them save a little bit of money, and let my colleagues in the House of Representatives know where the Sierra Club is on many issues and the importance of the environment to those things. We have a lot of challenges here in Boone County in terms of growth. I've been dealing with that for the last 8 years as the state representative from Southern Boone County. Growth is going to come to Boone County. The question is, how do we manage it? And we want to manage it in a way that's smart, a way that is economically friendly, in a way that is environmentally friendly. The biggest challenge we've had in the Ashland area, and Travis Ballinger has learned a lot about that this year, is trying to make sure that we have the appropriate infrastructure for the type of commercial growth that's going to come to that area. I've worked over the last 8 years in trying to get some grants from DNR and other folks to be able to do an environmental assessment of the Southern Boone County area to determine how we can put in a wastewater treatment facility. It doesn't make any sense to grow in Southern Boone the way we have in Northern Boone, where we have 70 different treatment facilities, a lot of lagoons, and a hodgepodge of development that I don't think is best for the environment or best for the homeowners and the people that are moving into Northern Boone County. We were successful at getting a DNR grant, matching it with some federal money to begin to study the losing streams, the state forests, the ecologically sensitive areas, and figure out how best to deal with the issue of wastewater and sewer so that when we do have this development that's going to come, we can do it in a way that's sound, that makes sense, and provides the least damage to the environment so we can all enjoy the county that we live in. Most of us have moved here. I won't ask people to raise their hands, but at any group that I run into, I'm not a native of here. A lot of people want to move in here, and then they love it so much they want to close the door. You can't just do that, and so that's why it's important that we grow in a responsible way, and I look forward to working with the members of this coalition in the state Senate on issues that affect not only Boone County, but the state of Missouri. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next we have Dan Fischbach.
Hi, I'm Dan Fischbach. Just a little bit about me for those of you who aren't familiar with me. I moved to Boone County about 7 years ago, and I have to say, it's a wonderful place to live. And as state representative, I hope to be able to continue to keep this tradition alive here in Boone County. I have the advantage over some in having lived a number of different places, some of which had probably the worst urban planning that you can imagine, including one metropolitan area which is currently over 250,000. It was atrocious. The city was a mess. It was impossible to get around. It was frequently referred to locally by those who moved there from out of town as the biggest one-street town in America. And like I said, it was a metropolitan area of over 225,000 people at that time. I choose not to name it because I don't want to embarrass one of my former communities. So having seen both ends of the spectrum and having carefully studied some of the issues, I especially enjoyed reading the Growth in the Heartland to give me some kind of a background in the types of issues that are of concern to this group. It really gave me some perspective. And I have to say, after reading all of this, I don't see a major crisis here in Boone County, and I don't see a major crisis here in Columbia. However, that does not mean that there are no areas of concern. There are many areas of concern, particularly in the fast growth out county and how we coordinate that growth with the city to make sure that we properly accommodate infrastructure and coordinate our plans. There are many things that need to be done along these lines to increase that coordination, to make sure that we are working together to reduce the number of, what Chuck referred to, all these little sewage systems. This is very inefficient, and long-term, it does not fit into a large overall plan. We have to really take a hard look at what we're doing up there and try to better coordinate all these infrastructure. This also includes roads, sewers, water, the full gamut. There are things that do need to be done, I believe, at the state level. There are some things there are some tools there that we may want to apply locally that it may be difficult to apply them at this time. And hopefully we'll get into some of those issues as we discuss some of the questions. But a lot of people would say, Dan, you're a conservative Republican. Why are you going before that group? I want everyone here to understand that conservatives are also concerned about the environment. And I want to listen to all my constituents, and I want to have an overall view of everyone's concerns. What I would like to see is a balance between shouting parties. We need to talk to each other, not shout. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And next we have Jeff Harris.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank, first of all, the Boone County Smart Growth Coalition for having this forum here this evening. I think democracy it just improves itself. Every time we have a candidate forum and we are allowed to share our views and our vision and our values with those people that we are charged with, and if we do our job that we are obligated to and really do a good job of representing in the state capitol in Jefferson City. I also want to thank those folks who are listening at home this evening on KOPN. I appreciate your interest in our democratic process, and I hope that this exchange here this evening is informative and that we all benefit in some respect from it. I want to say, first of all, in addition to that believe it or not, when it came out, I did read Growth in the Heartland. People sometimes kid me for reading anything I can get my hands on, but actually I had a conversation with Commissioner Karen Miller back in the winter of 2003, probably January 2003. Karen and I were talking about some issues affecting growth and the environment in the state of Missouri, and she said, you need to get this report from Brookings called Growth in the Heartland. I've actually cited it on the House floor a few times, got some blank looks, but not all the time. I think I've encouraged some of my colleagues to take that to heart as well. When we talk about growth and smart growth, it's a vision, I think, that reflects the community that I was born in and raised in, and that's this community. We look at what makes this a great community. It's a great community because of the quality of life that we enjoy, which in large part is a reflection of the opportunities that we have here when it comes to parks, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to open space. But we also have a sound, vibrant, and bustling economy. Those are the things I think that distinguish us from other communities. And I think it's our challenge going forward to maintain that level of growth while at the same time not getting rid of the quality of life that we have come to enjoy, that I have now enjoyed almost, tomorrow will be, for 40 years. Those are the challenges. That's our vision. Those are our values. And I've already started to implement that in Jefferson City. I was fortunate enough to attach to a piece of legislation that is now law, a provision that allows the City of Columbia and any municipality within Boone County to form a community development corporation. It doesn't cost the taxpayers $1, and it helps benefit the City of Columbia and downtown development. Thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. The next speaker is Travis Ballinger.
Good evening. My name is Travis Ballinger, and I'm running for state representative in the 24th district. It is a pleasure to be here this evening. I'd just like to thank everybody involved for inviting us here tonight. You know, I have to say this has been the longest job interview that I've ever had, but it's also been one of the most rewarding. I've met some really great people from Roachport to Columbia to Ashland to Hartsburg. It's been a great experience, and I look forward to serving them in the Missouri House. I'd like to give you some background information about myself. I was born and raised here in Columbia. I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri. I have a bachelor's degree in finance and banking. After I graduated from the university, I was able to get a banker crazy enough to loan me the money to start my own small business. And I started a furniture store over 10 years ago in Jefferson City. And I remember that first year, you know, it was really a struggle. And I worked that store 7 days a week, and I was finally able to get it to be successful. And eventually then I went on to open a second location in Columbia, and then a third location in Springfield, Missouri. I have over a decade of real-world small business experience that I will bring with me to Jefferson City. And I understand, you know, what it means to meet a payroll. I understand what it means to manage cash flow, and I understand budgets, and I'll bring that experience with me. Besides business, I do have family here in Columbia. My parents live out east of town. They live on a small farm. My father's worked for the Postal Service for nearly 40 years. I'm married. I have a wonderful wife. Her name's Kari. She's a clinical dietitian at Columbia Regional Hospital. One of the main reasons that I'm running for state representative is that I truly do believe that we need more small business owners in Jefferson City. My vision for Boone County in terms of growth and development is to work towards smart growth, where small business leaders understand that quality of life in Boone County is directly linked to economic prosperity, and that sprawl does threaten our quality of life. And we need to encourage smart growth projects that revitalize older neighborhoods, protects farmland, and encourages strong, healthy communities. I look forward to answering your questions this evening. I look forward to visiting with any of you after the forum, and I look forward to the opportunity to serve you in the Missouri House of Representatives.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. And our next speaker, I guess I should make sure I pronounce your last name right. There's no R in there, is there?
Correct.
So it's Bob Northup. Okay, it's Bob Northup.
I'd like for us to take a few seconds before I begin and take some time away from myself for us just to have a moment of silence and remembrance of our folks, our young people that are overseas and the hazard they're in, that there's a swift execution of this war and conclusion to it. I am Bob Northup. I was born on the university campus in the Old Noyes Hospital. I'm a graduate from Hickman High School. I studied biology in Central College in Fayette and also at the university. I've been a Columbia small businessman since 1967, owning and managing optical stores. Began dispensing hearing aids 13 years later in 1978. I was ordained into the gospel ministry in 1978 and have pastored small churches for 25 years, active. I am married to Beverly Northup, who is an American Indian historian and published author, and together we have 9 children. My affiliations are very limited because I've been very active in the ministry up until recently. I'm a member of Columbia Baptist Church, the National Federation of Independent Businessmen, Travelers Protection Association. I have been a member in the past of the Columbia Chamber of Commerce, haven't had time to really justify that. And in recent Senior Citizen Center, and for 25 years, I have offered free hearing screenings, eyeglass adjustments, and I do play the piano dinner music for the lunch program that they have. Haven't been as regular at that in the last few months as I have in the past. I look at, and I've been involved in issues with the county ever since planning and zoning came. I've always been in favor of planning only, as Cole County had for so long. I don't know if they have zoning yet or not, but I hate the concept of spot zoning and what it does to development. That is something that is the abuse of planning and zoning by people who get on the planning board and the planning and zoning board with self-interest. And I would want to limit those kinds of things in whatever way we can. We're certainly not going to be able to get that out of our government, I'm sure. But I got involved. There was a building code one time that was proposed here and put on the ballot without the building code being written yet. And my interest, which would be, not consistent with my Republican affiliations, is that I've always been interested in the average family and the average income family, lower income families, that they can have also the privilege of owning their own homes. I see the flags waving, so I'll quit at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And our next speaker is Judy Baker.
Good evening. I also thank the Smart Growth Coalition for hosting this tonight. It's very important topics for us to be discussing. And I agree with Jeff that the more that we get together and talk and dialogue, the better we are as a community. And the more that our good ideas bubble up. And I'm hoping that's a little bit of what might happen tonight as we share some of the things we've thought about and get questions from you and hear what you have come up with as ideas for our community. Just a little bit about me. I am running for the 25th District House seat. It is my privilege to even be considered to take Vicki Reback Wilson's seat, who has done a lot to help plan for this community and to hold the banner high for environmentalism and smart growth. I also was born in Boone County, and I am actually a Boone County boomerang. I've been back here 3 times, and we are one of those people that had you ask us to raise our hand, I would have raised my hand as a person who had moved back here to raise my family because of the lifestyle that we have here. We have a very, this is a smart growth symposium. We have a very smart community. And we should be leaders in the kind of planning that makes for sustainable lifestyle communities. I'm hoping that we can continue to do that and would lend my support in doing that. Bob might help me on this because it's an old Indian story, but the Indians, a group of Indians, always planned for all the decisions that they ever made are with the 7th generation in mind, 7th generation of their children. Whenever they would make decisions, they would make that with their future generations in mind. We're the 7th generation, they say, from Thomas Jefferson. And we today have the opportunity with smart growth planning to plan for our 7th generation. I have 3 children, and I would like to leave a better place tomorrow than we have today. So we have an obligation for stewardship to future generations. More specifically, my vision for Boone County is to foster communities much like a community in Atlanta that I'm familiar with called Serenbe Community, which is a sustainable lifestyle community that is a prototype and model for what we can do. In that community, they have performance-based homes or planning for performance-based homes, sustainable lifestyle development with conservation subdivisions, water treatment plants or alternative water treatment right in the neighborhoods with organic tiering. And I'm hoping that we can make at the state level grants available for this kind of planning. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And before we start the questions, KOPN is going to break for a 4-minute pledge break. And so that I don't cut off the speaker at this point, I'll do the same thing in the crowd here is see if any of you will pledge to KOPN. This will be the only interruption we have in terms of the forum here. They'll probably go to another break near the end of the hour, but then they'll re-record what the speaker had and have that go on. But we have some forms here that are on the back table, and I can pass some out. And their campaign is to vote for KOPN, and no matter who you vote for in these races, the KOPN vote doesn't have an opponent, so it's unopposed race. If you can vote with your pocketbook, you can send a credit card donation or whatever if you like, and Margot was gracious enough to let us use her show for this, so if you do it during her show, then she'll get credit for getting those pledges in. And hopefully they'll give me a signal when the 4 minutes are up so I can go to the next question. And what we're gonna do on the order there is we're just, to make it simple, we'll keep going the same direction, but each time we'll start with a different speaker. So when we do go to the question, Dan Fishbach will lead off and we'll come around, and then Chuck Graham will be the last person to speak on that question.
Oh, you can announce that it will be on public access television?
Oh, yes, this is also being broadcast on public access television, which is Channel 3. And so some people have an opportunity to see that on public access television. Smart Growth Coalition, in case for people aren't familiar, is working to protect areas of natural significance, to preserve and revitalize urban neighborhoods, to preserve the area's natural character, to conserve open space, to encourage the viability of family farms, to discourage leapfrog development, and to reduce public subsidy of infrastructure to the extent that it supports and encourages urban sprawl. We're also committed to having dialogue with city, county, and state officials, and to conduct forums like this where those people who are running to be your elected officers have an opportunity to listen to your concerns and also to express their opinions on issues that are important to the community and to people who are concerned about growth and economic. To have here tonight are Chuck Graham from the 19th Senate District, and his opponent is Mike Ditmore. From the 23rd District, we have Jeff Harris and Dan Fishbach. From the 24th District, Travis Ballinger, and his opponent is Ed Robb. From the 25th District, Judy Baker and Bob Northup. And at this point, are we clear for questions, Jeff? I'm going to wait till we get a signal.
We are going back and we will turn it on right now. Thanks.
Okay, our first question then is as follows. Many experts believe we are reaching peak oil and that we will run out of oil in the foreseeable future. Agriculture uses a lot of petroleum to run machinery and treat crops with pesticides and herbicides. What can government do to move Missouri and Boone County to a more sustainable future? And we'll begin with Dan Fishbach.
Well, in fact, it isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. We indeed are going to run out of oil. None of us knows with any certainty exactly when that is going to happen. But we do know that we have to prepare for that. One of the most important things we should be looking at with regard to energy use is that oil and natural gas, which are the most portable sources of energy, should be reserved for applications which require portable energy sources. That would include automobiles and airplanes. Now, that doesn't say we need to keep depending only on automobiles, but in the larger scheme of things, every time we use oil or natural gas to produce electricity, which could be produced by other means, we're making a poor decision in terms of responsible use of oil. There are things we can do. Fortunately, we have a lot of crops around here, and I'm a very strong supporter of anything that the state and federal government can do to continue to promote ethanol and biodiesel. These are very important. A mistake we made that I wish we could take back was shutting down the super collider in Texas, because the real future of energy is nuclear fusion. And that's not likely to happen anytime soon until we get another super collider built. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fishbach. And I guess I forgot to mention again that each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer each question. And the next person to speak will be Jeff Harris.
Well, since we're on the Farm and Fiddle show on KOPN, and I am running for re-election to the state legislature. Let's talk about sustainable ag, and let's talk about what we can do at the state level to continue to support sustainable agriculture. It's very important to our future. We're an agrarian state by history. We still have a strong farm economy in this state. And I want to applaud the University of Missouri-Columbia for being one of the first institutions in the country, to establish a degree-granting program in sustainable agriculture. It is our charge as legislators, particularly from this community, to continue to support that program and to support our university to make sure that that program stays intact and even grows more. We got to do that. Let's also talk about sustainable agriculture support from the state beyond what the university does. And I'm talking about our farmers markets. Those credits and subsidies from the state level to farmers markets have been the subject of cuts by the folks in charge in Jefferson City. I oppose what they have done there, and I will continue to oppose that. We need to continue to bolster our farmers markets in the state of Missouri through sustainable ag support.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And next we have Travis Ballinger.
I think through ethanol research, development, and production, we can stimulate Missouri's economic growth while moving us toward a sustainable energy future. I know that subsidies give incentives to fuel blenders to build more plants, which actually create jobs and create a higher demand for farmers' corn here in Missouri. And so I think by creating jobs, we are creating economic growth. So I would support efforts to encourage ethanol production here in Missouri. The Alternative Energy Initiative in Columbia is bold in that it would foster a market for alternative energy technologies, continuing to fund research at the university, fostering a climate for the production of alternative energy sources, and creating markets for those fuels are really keys to moving Missouri and Boone County toward sustainability.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next we have Bob Northup.
Well, we can limit a lot of the need for fuel for agriculture if we just support programs that are buy local and grow local, like the farmers market and anything else in that vein. And so that I'm in favor of and we're work toward. Secondly, there is a very exciting new product called green fuel. It's being developed in Alaska, which is taking coal and turning it into oil, an oil substitute that is only 25% as expensive as crude oil is today. It's about $12.50 is their projected cost of producing that. And so we've got something on the horizon there that's exciting. But at the same time, I want to see that agriculture has a part in this and that the small farmer has a part because then it is creating the jobs and it is bringing up the price of their commodities. And just want to say that I wished I had time to tell you how much I appreciate the efforts of smart growth and that there's a balance there with Ready.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. Next we have Judy Baker.
Thank you. We've got to break our addiction to fossil fuels is what we need to do first. We need to do that by funding more alternative energy initiatives, making grants available for innovations and research and so on. And I think that'll go a long way. One thing I think we really need to do is to raise the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards, to help us break our addiction to fossil fuels. Right now it's at 20 plus MPGs, and we have cars that can get as much as 40 and 50 miles per gallon. I think that we should offer incentives, tax perhaps incentives like we do for SUVs in the federal level for the hybrid cars. That would be a good alternative to using a lot of fossil fuels. Perhaps we could do that at the state level, or maybe that may have to be done at the federal level, but we can start pushing as a community to do that. As far as the farm economy goes, I think ethanol will help us there. The ethanol question is more a farm economy question than an environmentalist question. It's adding ethanol to our mix of available fuels is going to help with some pollution and availability of fossil fuel and so on. But For the most part, we've got to look at all of the other alternatives as well and do some wind mapping and see what we can do with the probably the cleanest renewable source of wind.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And next we have Chuck Graham.
I think Judy's onto a lot of the right ideas here. I think we certainly could put in place some tax incentives for the development of alternative fuels, alternative machinery. I know Doc Wolf is working on a patent right here in Columbia on some machinery that would do that, and so we certainly need to encourage that business development. I think I agree with Judy also in terms of requiring better fuel efficiency standards. You know, I grew up during the 70s and the 80s, and after the big oil crisis of the early 70s, we required Detroit to make cars that were more fuel efficient. California is doing that now, and there's no reason we can't do that. Technology can free us in many ways from our dependence on oil, but we've got to have political leadership that is willing to do something about that. And frankly, when you have Bush and Cheney in the White House, both who were oil executives, I don't think that they have any incentive to break our addiction to oil. And I would rather spend the money that they're spending in a war in Iraq on spending that on better technology that can free us from that dependence on oil. And I wish we had national leadership that would do that, because it's time that we break that dependence on Middle Eastern oil. And we can't do that as long as Bush and Cheney are president and vice president.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And our next question will begin with Jeff Harris, and this is going to be appropriate to the Farm and Fiddle show as well. This question is, if elected, what will you do to help family farms in Missouri to survive and thrive against the ever-increasing threat of annihilation by big industry?
Well, I guess I answer that by saying what I will continue to do. I voted against House Bill 1177 last year, which would have really loosened a lot of the regulations on CAFOs in the state of Missouri. Particularly troubling to me was the fact that a CAFO could move in, and by that I mean confined animal feeding operation, a CAFO could move in next door to anybody, and with no more than 1 day's notice. I don't think that's the right thing we should do in the state of Missouri. I think it's reasonable to require a little more notice than that. I also want to talk about something called the SAC Act. Now, if my colleague Wes Schumeyer were here, he could probably, it's his bill, he could probably talk about it for the next 2 hours. He is the expert on that issue, but basically, very simply, you have purchased seed from a conglomerate, and you don't use all that seed when you plant your crops for that season, you can keep that seed and use it again next year. Seems pretty simple to me. If you buy the seed, you own it, you ought to be able to use it again the next year.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next we have Travis Ballinger.
I grew up on a small farm, so I understand, the challenges facing family farms, and I would support family farms by protecting them from unfair competition, like what Jeff mentioned with the large CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations they're really hiding under the umbrella of a family farm, but in reality they're a large corporation. I support farmers markets, which create local outlets for Missouri farm produce, and I also again support ethanol production, which would create higher demand for corn. And like Jeff, I do support legislation like House Bill 829, which would strike that balance between the interests of farmers who use the genetically modified seed. The bill by Wes Schumeyer, would allow, like Jeff said, farmers to retain their seed, and it's estimated that it would save farmers $61 million annually. And so I would definitely support that type of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next we have Bob Northup.
The producing sustainable as opposed to producing in confined areas in big industry scheme of things, that's what I would favor, and to just raise agricultural products on the ground on the local farm like man's done for thousands of years. That way, again, you do not eat up fuel moving food to big industry. Animal and food producers like Cargill and Conagra. I come from the point of view of a small businessman. The family farmer is a small businessman. I've been that for 4 decades. It's reasonable that I would support other small business. I fight for the cause of the family farmer. I always have. I do not mean local farmers. I do not mean local farmers, family farmers, in the sense that Jay Nixon defined continental grain. Another problem I see in all this is current commodities market setup in our nation. With the current setup, big industry, with the commodities market is able to buy low, some farmers can hold that produce, but most are serfdom underneath Monsanto and ConAgra, Tyson, Smithfield, Cargill, Continental, and ADM.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. Next, we have Judy Baker.
Our farms are our life bread, and so, and not only for the fact that they provide us what we eat and many other things, but they are also a large part of Missouri's economy. So I think it's very important at the state level that we would nurture new agricultural alternatives on a regular basis by developing revamping the Agro-Missouri program to encourage purchase of ag products produced by farmers, co-ops, and cottage industries in Missouri and promote those cottage industries. We also need to create a system of research and education, outreach, and advocacy to promote healthy farming and food systems in Missouri. I'd like to also, it's already been mentioned here, but I'd also like to see us continue to allow county ordinances to regulate CAFOs, because CAFOs can really do a lot of damage to a farming community. And at the local level, they should be able to regulate themselves, especially for the health problems that coexist with CAFOs. Those kinds of things are what I would support when I get to the State House.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Next, we have Chuck Graham.
Thank you. First of all, let me talk about the things that I've done. In my first term down in Jefferson City, I had a bill that would treat CAFOs like the industries that there are. They're not family farms. And if you take a look in terms of business, agriculture gets taxed on their property at 11%. Commercial property is at 33 or 34%. They're not farms. These pigs are in a tiny little stall, so small that they can't turn around in. They never smell dirt. When they grow up, they live, they're slaughtered at a CAFO facility. Okay, these are factories. So if we're going to have commercial facilities that are raising hogs or cattle or anything else in the future, then we ought to treat them like commercial facilities. I got beaten on that bill in committee by every major farm industry group, and that's part of the problem. There's a disconnect between family farmers and what they understand politically. They think that these big industry groups are for them. But if you see what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years, we don't have a single independent poultry producer left in the state. They're all under contract to the big corporations. And it's all turning into corporate farming. And what we need to do is support organizations like Missouri Farmers Union instead of places like the Missouri Farm Bureau, who are only going to work for corporate agriculture and not family farms anymore. And I think it's a travesty.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Next, we have Dan Fischbach.
I grew up on a farm in South Dakota. We called it a ranch. I guess primarily because we mostly did livestock, not crops. I can guarantee you there is no one more concerned for the survival of the family farm, the family ranch, whatever you want to call it, than I am. I have two brothers struggling to survive on the homestead, which my grandfather set up in 1910. I'm very attuned to these issues. I'm concerned for the small farmer. What I think we most need to do is make sure that we are not subsidizing big ag in the forms of the type facilities that Chuck was talking about. I actually agree wholeheartedly with almost everything that everyone has brought up here. We need to make sure that we hold tough environmental standards on those feedlot operations, and at the same time we have to make sure that we're not providing tax incentives and through other laws we're not subsidizing these operations to the detriment of the family farm. America really thrives on inexpensive food. This works against the family farmer, but you as consumers have a responsibility too. You can make a big difference in the choices you make when you go through the grocery store. You can make a big difference when you buy American beef, and make sure that you ask your grocer or your Big W store where they get their beef.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And our next question, we're going to begin with Travis Ballinger. And the question is In the midst of ever-increasing residential and commercial development throughout the county, preserve and protect areas of unique natural, geological, and historic significance, so those areas will be preserved for future generations to enjoy. Mr. Ballinger.
The city and the county both have ordinances in place that protect and preserve, and I'm sure that there are areas that need to be strengthened. I know that off of Green Meadows Road in the 24th District, there's a piece of property that's been very controversial because of what the developer was originally planning. I was on the side of the residents. You wouldn't have found my sign located on the developer's land like my opponents. But what we do need to do is really strike a balance, in developing by planning for parks and also ensuring that housing costs remain fair. Recently, the state awarded Boone County a $75,000 grant to convert land at the fairgrounds into playing fields. And as state representative, I would work to bring funding for park lands to developing areas. For instance, the MKT Trail. It provides an important green belt for our community, and it shelters sensitive waterways. And with state help, the trail could extend into newer areas of development. I think by planning sensible, balanced development with parks and developing areas in the city that are not being used, we can help to protect our natural heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next, we have Bob Northup.
When I was studying at UMC in the mid-60s, I took a course in ecology taught by Dr. Campbell. He went out into the countryside a few miles from Columbia each year, would set up his camera and take photos from the same locations in the same direction annually. It was tragic to see those photos as Greenfield slowly was destroyed. This stirred the Native American part of my blood to be a wise use environmentalist in the sense that we as humans should be stewards of the land. Like the DAR, there are many historic sites of Cherokee and of all kinds of different types, historic, that I would like to see registered and protected regarding those areas of our history. As the next Missouri House member for the 25th District in Columbia, I'll do all that I'm able to protect Greenfield and our geological and historic heritage in Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And next we have Judy Baker.
In the last 20 years, the increase in development of land has been 45%. 70% of that development has happened in New Greenfield. This is an alarming trend and speaks to what's happening with the other 30% and how is it becoming successful and how can we go back into already developed places and redevelop them in ways that would make more sense, smart planning. I would like to look to promote communities in which resources are not used up more quickly than they are replenished, and where minimum impact is made on biodiversity and the environment, all while providing and sustaining economic stability. They are not mutually exclusive. It has been found in the community that I mentioned in my opening, the Serenbe community in Atlanta. The planning that has gone on as it has gone on, the landowners and developers that are planning this have found that they can actually increase the property value by smart planning. So it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive to do these new innovations and plan at the same time. So I would like to see smart buildings and smart planning, which will increase the resale value of property. Wastewater treatments right in the neighborhoods. A friend of mine was telling me that you can do wastewater treatment in organic and biodiverse ways using plants, tiering of plants and so on. So I'd like to see us try some of those new ideas.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And next we have Chuck Graham.
Thank you. First of all, I think it's important that we try to grow in a smart way. That's what I've tried to do in southern Boone County and trying to develop the appropriate wastewater treatment facilities because growth is going to happen. The question is, how are you going to manage it? And as elected officials, what's important is that you are willing to come out and talk with everybody that's involved. I want to salute Bob and Dan for being here tonight, because you don't see my opponent here tonight and you don't see Ed Robb here tonight. Maybe they're meeting with Mr. Stoldryer or Mr. Eckhoff to see what next dense development they'd like to put up at Green Meadows. But what's important is you have to be able to meet with everybody involved. Every Democrat that's up here went to the Central Missouri Development Council when they asked us to talk. We go to the Farm Bureau knowing that they're not going to endorse us. even though they don't agree with our positions. Because you know what? We keep it an open door, and we try to talk with everybody. Because if you don't get everybody in a room and come up with a solution that works for everyone, all you're going to have is battle after battle after battle. And you know what? You're going to win some and you're going to lose some. But I'll tell you, I appreciate everyone who took the time to come here tonight and listen to everybody, especially for those who thought that they were going to be in a tough political environment. I respect their guts for coming here and listening to you, because once you're elected, you don't just represent the special interests that might have helped to get you there. You represent everybody in Boone County, and I'd like to thank those two for being here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next, we have one of those two, Dan Fischbach.
I'd like to thank Chuck for taking some of his time to thank me. I do sincerely appreciate that. I'm not afraid of people knowing where I stand on the issues. There are areas that I'm sure I disagree with most of you here, but I think there are more areas that I agree with you than there are areas that I disagree. Now for the real question, which had something to do with natural, geological, and historic places. Having grown up in the wilds of South Dakota, I've developed an eye for natural beauty. And so I really appreciate that, and these things are worth preserving. But certainly we cannot preserve everything. But certainly those special places, caverns, I love caves, Rock Ridge, Morrow Park, any place that is truly unique and has that type of appeal to the community, I will promise you that I will be very open to any grassroots effort to support preserving those areas to the extent that that is reasonable. Again, any reasonable thing. That doesn't mean I'm going to protect every tree, but I guarantee you, if there is true, unique significance in that area, I will be supportive of local efforts to preserve those places.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And next, we have Jeff Harris.
Well, one of the things we can do, again, where we strike a balance between growth and preservation, is to encourage growth in our downtown and adjacent areas. And that's why I'm proud to have put Columbia and Boone County into House Bill 289, which is the Missouri Downtown Economic Stimulus Act. I saw this bill as an opportunity for us to really gain some benefit here in Columbia. I didn't know when I first read it why St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield were offered opportunities, but we here in Columbia were not. So in a bipartisan way, I went to the Republican sponsor of that bill. I said, here's my amendment. Here's what I want to do for the taxpayers and the people that I represent back in Columbia. We talked about it. He put it in his bill, and it is now law. In fact, it became law in August of 2003. That's the type of smart growth I think we need in the Missouri General Assembly, and that's what I intend to continue to do. And along those lines, we need to make sure that we preserve the historic preservation tax credit, which I know we're going to address here in a minute. But it's been on the chopping block the last 2 years that I've been in the General Assembly. It serves a real purpose, again, striking that balance between economic growth and preservation of the resources that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And as we approach the second hour of this show, I think what we're going to do at this point is we'll alternate audience questions with smart growth questions. So at this point, I'll be able to take an audience question, but before I do that, I'd like to suggest that audience questions, if you could phrase your question in under 30 seconds. And the question should be addressed to the entire panel. It shouldn't be like a loaded question like directed at one of the candidates, because it's got to be something that everybody can answer. And if you could keep it relatively on topic so that it has something to do with growth or energy or environment issues, we're not going to, in this particular forum, we don't want to deal with the whole constellation of issues that are available, but keep it focused on growth related or smart growth type issue questions. So if I see the first hand, you can go up to the microphone. And I guess the first person who will be answering this question will be Bob Northup.
Hi, I'm Jo Sapp from the League of Women Voters. I'd like for you to discuss the relative merits and disadvantages to TIFs and TDVs. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
TIFs and
You're
TDDs.
gonna have to unwind that for me.
Okay.
I'm pretty new in this.
TIFs
area.
is, I forget exactly what it is, but it's where,
Tax incremental finance.
thank you. And TDDs is a special tax district that is being used right now by some of the major developers in this community.
Ma'am, still TIFs, I have a hearing impairment, and he spoke at the same time you were. Tell me what TIFs are.
Tax increment financing. And that is where, it was originally designed to take a piece of property that was underdeveloped and not being productive on the tax rolls, to give them an incentive to develop that land. The land would forgive the taxes for a period of time and bring that back into productive use of the tax rolls. There are some disadvantages to that though, and there's some very loose definition of how that can be used.
Okay, I don't think I can address that issue intelligently without studying it. I certainly will study that issue. But on the other, I call them special tax districts. Those type of situations, I don't think are fair the way they're being handled right now, because the thing that we need to do is we're going into a new concept, which I totally agree with, and that is that when we do new development, that the people who are going to earn the money off of that pay for the infrastructure that is involved in the improvements that are there. I think they should share a great percentage of that. A lot of situations in the way those things are handled, only 4% is rewarded back to the city. And the county, there's an inequity there. This is one of the questions that's coming up. And I think that there should be a substantial cost for those people that are in special tax districts, that we should not have to put that on the average person, because the people go in and purchase products and things, and they have to share that. Why should it be put on them? The developer and the businesses are the ones that should make those expenditures. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And next we have Judy Baker.
I think it's a very complex situation. I'm not real sure I have any answers to it, but I will talk a little bit about what the different items are. The way that those work, I do feel is a regressive type tax. You can either tax folks for the infrastructure building, or you can pass that on to the retailer or the developer or whomever, but it will come back to us in prices, I'm afraid. So that's a regressive tax as well. How to structure it just so those who get the most benefit off of the development actually pay a share of that development in some way up front, or during, or amortized over time or whatever, it still eludes me some, and I would be open to ideas and discussion about how to do that. Make sure it's not a regressive tax on people.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And next we have Chuck Graham.
I've been opposed to using TIFs here in Boone County. We talked about doing it about 4 years ago down in Ashland when they were trying to track the Dollar General warehouse that is now over in Fulton. It made no sense to me to waive the property taxes for this business and for 800 employees for 20 years. And then 800 families would move to Ashland. Their kids would go to school, and we wouldn't have the money for that school district, for that fire district, or for that library district to take care of the children that are moving to town with those families for $8 an hour jobs. Boone County's a better place than that. We don't have to do that. We're not a blighted area. I think there's a lot of abuse of TIFs. I've seen a lot of that in St. Charles County, where they've got plenty of property wealth, and they've TIFed the Home Depots and everyone else over there. And now their schools are broke because they've given away those property taxes for a certain amount of years. So I don't think that that's a smart thing to do. Transportation development districts, I believe that those at this point, because of the underfunding of MoDOT, are probably a necessary evil. There's just not enough money to take care of the highways that we have right now. And if we've got a place that has an incredible amount of growth and development, and someone's able to front that money because MoDOT is not able to pay for that, and it makes it a safer development in terms of roads, it may be necessary to take a look at that. And I think you'll see more TDDs taking place. I know they passed one up in the Kirksville area, the 4-lane Highway 63, which makes that a lot safer area. And so I'd support TDDs in some circumstances, but I don't think that Boone County needs to give away our property taxes to attract commercial development. I think we've got plenty of it coming here anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Next, we have Dan Fischbach.
Tough to discuss two completely different issues in 90 seconds, but I will tell you the TIF, as originally conceived, I think it did some great things, particularly for inner cities. I think it's been seriously maligned. I applaud Chuck for opposing that misuse of this type funding in that particular application. Although it was local and not some big shopping center in St. Louis or Kansas City, especially in St. Louis, where it's also being abused, it's the same type misuse of what was a good idea to take care of blighted areas in central cities. I think we need to seriously tighten the TIF provisions if we sustain them at all, but I would like to put something in there, so maybe we could do something for downtown Columbia, but it would have to be seriously modified for that to even be considered here in Columbia due to the scope of the projects. TDDs, I see them as, yes, a necessary evil. I don't see having the money to do major improvements. Some people want to say, make the developer pay for it all. What that fails to recognize is that many of these interchanges are not going to only serve that one business or that one development. It's going to overall improve traffic flow in that area for the city as a whole, and I don't know of a better way to do it. And as a matter of fact, if we could put a TDD over the whole intersection of 63 and 70 and pay for a real interchange there, I would support that in a heartbeat.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And now we have Jeff Harris.
Well, my favorite TIF story is about a law firm in Kansas City that used a TIF to move from near the plaza in Kansas City to nearer to the plaza in Kansas City. I'm not sure anyone would believe that the plaza is in need of commercial development, or that it is in any way blighted, or something where we need to give someone, particularly a bunch of lawyers, and I can say that because I am one, give them an incentive to move to a prosperous commercial area. Now, we shouldn't rule them out altogether, but we have to be smart about it. That's an abuse. We have to rein in the abuses of TIFs. With respect to TDDs, I think the key there is transparency. I don't think people recognize, because it is a newer concept, folks perhaps don't recognize as much what a TDD is. If we're going to raise people's taxes, and if the people who are in these TDDs are promoting them, retailers, they're going to raise people's taxes. Tell them that you're doing it. Tell them how much more they're going to pay, and tell them specifically what it's going to go for when we speak of the infrastructure. I mean, how much better is the road going to be? How much bigger or wider the sidewalks going to be? Just be transparent and open about it. But again, as Chuck also pointed out, our roads need to be paved in this state with something more than good intentions, and we're looking at all kinds of options.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next, we have Travis Ballinger.
I think that a TIF should only be used in blighted areas, and I think here in Boone County, I don't think that we need the TIF financing. I think there has been a lot of misuse and abuse over the years, but if we do have the TIF provision, I think that we need accountability. If a company comes in and they promise us 500 jobs, and they better deliver us 500 jobs. And so, in regards to TDDs. I think we need to look at it a case-by-case basis. A negative would be that it is a regressive tax. A positive would be that, the money is actually earmarked for a certain project to help pay for some infrastructure costs. So,
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. And our next question will be one on the growth list, but this is a little bit of it. We put this one in here at the last minute. This one hasn't been sent to the candidates, so it's kind of like an audience question, but it's from one of the county commissioners, and so we thought to listen carefully to this one, particularly the person who has to speak first, and it'll be addressed to Judy Baker first. And the question is, do you support the present work to improving the planning statutes for county government? The statutes have not been updated since adoption in the 1930s. The American Planning Association and the Missouri Commission on Intergovernmental Cooperation have a working group looking at the updates needed to bring the state of Missouri to the 21st century, and the Growth in the Heartland report identified this as a major weakness for the state. Judy Baker.
Well, this would go back probably to something I said earlier about us being a smart community. And with all of those smarts, we ought to be putting those smarts to good work. And it sounds to me like I'm not very familiar with this, and thank you very much, Skip, if you put this out here for us. I'm not very familiar with it, but it sounds to me on first blush that something that old needs probably to be updated, and I would support the proposal.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Next we have Chuck Graham.
Well, I'm going to try to help save my friend Skip. That sounds more like a Karen Miller question than a Skip Elkin question. Certainly there's a certain amount of authority that first-class non-charter counties have to be able to update their policies and procedures. If there's some permission that they need to have because they don't have home rule from the legislature to be able to do some more or have some more oversight, I would certainly be open to talking with the commission. They can certainly bring us some draft legislation. I'd be more than happy to consider it as we go into session. And so, it's really a county issue, and probably a better question for the candidates that are running for commissioner. But whoever wins in November, if they'd like to come talk to the local delegation before we go down to Jefferson City and they need some more authority since they don't have home rule, we've passed lots of amendments and legislation to give them that. Jeff talked about one earlier. I passed the authority to be able to pass Proposition L as a sales tax for law enforcement, and sometimes counties do need our help to have the authority to do the things they want to do. I'd be more than happy to work with them.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Next we have Dan Fishbach.
I'm probably one of the few people that has moved to Boone County since 1997 that studied thoroughly the entire issue of home rule and all of that entailed. And I was astounded when I saw what happened to that fight. A noble idea gone awry. I don't know if there were too many fingers in the pot. I'm not maligning either side because I have very good friends on both sides of that issue. But certainly, as it relates to planning at the county level, I think the county needs more authority, and I think the county needs to really look ahead and really work closely with the city, and anything that needs to be done in Jeff City that can encourage cooperation between the city and the county and make it easier for the county to do what it needs to do to coordinate infrastructure as it develops. I really think it's an important issue, and I think it's something that needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Mr. Fishbach. Next we have Jeff Harris.
Well, believe it or not, I've actually had a conversation with that very commissioner about this very subject, and it was one of the reasons why I read the Growth in the Heartland report to begin with. I didn't know that particular person was going to ask that question, but I will tell you, it is a serious issue when we look at some of our statutes in this state with respect, for example, to planning and zoning. Only 21 out of Missouri's 114 counties have planning and zoning authority. These statutes, many of these statutes were set up for a 1920s and 1930s Missouri when a lot of us didn't have, in this state, didn't have indoor plumbing, and the concept of an exurban or suburban area was, you'd be like speaking Latin to people if you used those words back in the 20s and 30s. Yes, we need to update our statutes. Yes, we need to give counties authority, not to hinder growth, but to just simply bring that authority into the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And next we'll hear from Travis Ballinger.
I do think that it is a county issue, but if I was elected state representative, I'd always make myself available to talk with county commissioners. I think there needs to be a good line of communication, and definitely, I would support updating the statutes.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. And next we have Bob Northup.
Well, of course, I'm the one that's responsible for us not having home rule here, and I won't hide that. But we don't have, with those proposals, we would have lost the elections of our clerk, recorder, treasurer, assessor, collector, county sheriff on one situation. And when you go to Jackson County, or you go to St. Louis County or Greene County, it's not user-friendly government. Dealing with bureaucrats, all they do is push you. They say, the only person I answer to is the county executive. And they push you back and forth, and it's not a good system of government. I like the American system of county government, of being able to elect your own administrators. And so it is a state issue. The legislature does have to keep up, and we have changing needs all the time, and statutory government, which we have, has to have those adjustments. And I will certainly, of all people up here, be in the state legislature in Missouri to fight for those changes for each of those levels of statutory government in our state.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And now we can take another question from somebody in the audience. Anybody in the audience want to ask a question? If not, we have plenty up here. But Alice? I guess Chuck Graham will be the first one to answer this question.
Chuck, what strategies would you use to solve some of Boone County's major development problems? Problems like a huge proliferation of big box stores in our community. Problems like the development community actually hiring a paid staff, a lobbyist to represent them before the city council and other governmental bodies. Problems like a city and county planning and zoning which aren't working, well, maybe could work better together. Those are some examples. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Graham?
First of all, I think one of the things that we can do as a state is try to put those businesses on a level playing field with our small businesses. The fact that Home Depot does not have to pay corporate income tax in this state, but Mike Teal at Mid-City Lumber does. Don Sentinel at Ashland Lumber does. The Eiferts have to do that, Boone County Lumber. I just don't think that that's fair, and they've already got an unfair competition with the tax structure and just their buying power. And for them not to have to pay their fair share in this state, I think that's unfortunate, and it's something that Bob Holden tried to get done, and we weren't able to get done. But I certainly think we need to close the Jeffrey loophole and make sure that they're on at least a level playing field in terms of paying their fair share as they go along. In terms of whether the Central Missouri Development Council or developers can pay a lobbyist, they've got every right to be able to do that. The Sierra Club has a lobbyist. Carla Klein spends a lot of time in my office in Jefferson City. Every group has the ability to do that. Ken Midkiff did it for years before that, and so did Chris Hayday. So I wouldn't limit their ability to be able to do that. But I think that putting in place more tools for Boone County government to be able to operate, and unfortunately they still need permission from the state legislature for so many things. I think that there, in the future, really should be some sort of modified home rule where we do let our county make up its own rules. But I agree with Bob, we should not take away all those elected offices that were the last proposal. And I think at some point we really need to move toward a system like that.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Next we have Dan Fishbach.
I think a lot of this is merely a question of foresight, number one. Number two, coming up with a plan and sticking with it. Number three, supporting what that plan supports. Too many times I think we failed to realize we had a problem until the cart was out of the horse was out of the barn. A good example is the Walmart thing. That was already zoned. I don't know how you stop it after it's already zoned. That's a legally done thing. Now, do we have to go to less C1 commercial zoning and more planned commercial development to where we're not going to see anybody build anything without some oversight in terms of how this fits into the neighborhood and those other areas? I don't know long term. I do know right here just recently, now it didn't have to do with big box stores, but we're concerned about sprawl. We're concerned about housing density, and just 2 days ago, they had a plan to put in some townhouses or apartments, and due to opposition by the neighbors, that plan fell aside, and now single-family dwellings are going in there, and there's going to be a third as many families on that plot. We need to work together on these things. I frankly was appalled. The developer actually wanted to conform with the city's plan for that area, and
the local people didn't support it.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And next we have Jeff Harris.
Alice, in many ways, it's a local issue that the commissioners and the planning and zoning and the city council members are really in the best position to address. It's not something that we vote on or have any more say on in Jefferson City than any other taxpayer. But I will tell you that with respect to issues that we deal with in Jefferson City, as the grandson of a small business owner, a guy who put his son through college, a first-generation college student, I think it's incumbent upon us in Jefferson City to make sure we have a level playing field for Missouri's small business people and Missouri business people, and not give too many or any breaks or incentives to big out-of-state folks who drive our local mom and pop businesses out of business. That's unfortunate, and it is something we can do, we can address in Jefferson City, and I will continue to address that.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And next we have Travis Ballinger.
Well, I am a small business owner, and I agree wholeheartedly with both Jeff and Chuck that we need to get these big box stores on a level playing field with the small businesses, and I will work to close those corporate tax loopholes. In regards to the development question, I think that we just need to get everybody at the table. We need to start with areas that we agree on and find a way to work together. The overall goal should be to keep mid-Missouri, as one of the best places to live, and so I would work on that.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next we have Bob Northup.
Well, I believe in ableocracy, and I'd fight for an equal economic and social opportunities and playing field for all citizens and businesses in my district and in our state. I agree with Dan on a lot of the things that he said. He expressed a lot of my heart there. As a person that was an opponent to home rule, I know how to write a charter that's a great charter. And I'd be glad to be involved in it. I asked to be on the Charter Writing Commission, and I just didn't get on by a narrow margin of the ad. It was the judge that had the decision there, again, this is something that I will work with. It's something I understand very well, and would love to be involved with. In helping the commissioners locally to make decisions and things.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And next we'll hear from Judy Baker.
It's cheap land that makes for sprawl, and we actually do have a lot of cheap land, and that's part of our problem. We'd like to redevelop our urban centers, and so I would be willing at the state level to look at ways that we can perhaps do more enterprise zone or subsidies to help reuse land that's already been used and needs to be redeveloped, which is always more expensive than just using new greenfield. So I think that's one thing at the state level we could perhaps do to help with county planning. Also, perhaps bringing some funds available for granting for planning. When it comes time for a county and groups and communities to make plans, they need some experts these days, and the experts do have ideas, and actually that kind of investment up front has a huge return on investment on the back end, because the planning has been done up front by people who have done this before, have seen other models, and are willing to help us out. I'd also like to see communities being able to plan for themselves, being able to do mixed use land use projects where homes can be built that, kind of going back to the way things used to be, where perhaps you build a whole community around putting the shops underneath and people live above. And so you're going more vertical, you're using less land, and you're creating walk communities where there's parks and lots of green space, and people have everything near them and around them that they need.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. The next question will be addressed first to Dan Fischbach. This is going to be a two-part question, and since you only have 90 seconds, you can answer both parts, or if you feel like you can only answer one part, well, I suppose that's an option too. But the question is as follows. What would you do if elected to support downtown development, which is traditionally much tougher than greenfield development, but key to protecting the central city area? And the second part of that question is, would you oppose efforts to cap or eliminate the historic preservation tax credit? which is a program that helps property owners restore historic properties by offering tax credits to bridge any financing gaps. Mr. Fischbach.
I'm going to address the second question first because I think I'd give you a quick and dirty on that. I would have to look at what it's currently doing and evaluate it in overall effect on the budget. But certainly, I don't, to my knowledge, know that it is being abused or that it is out of hand. But that should be looked at. I certainly would be in favor of preserving that, provided that it's not being misused and not getting exorbitant in cost. As far as downtown development, gosh, it's a real hard thing. A TIF doesn't really apply unless we change the definitions of TIFs. What you do to develop the downtown, it's a very tough thing. And I certainly would look for ways to provide incentives or something, but I don't have any specific ideas unless there's some way to provide a tax incentive through a special legislation along the lines of a TIF. That's all I can say on that.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. Next, we have Jeff Harris.
Well, I'll tell you what we did do. As we mentioned earlier, we did put Columbia and Boone County in House Bill 289 as part of the MODESA bill, the Downtown Economic Stimulus Act. I looked at that bill, I read that bill, and I saw that Columbia and Boone County weren't in there, and I said it's about time that we got the same recognition that St. Louis, Kansas City, and same opportunities as St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield have. So because of our efforts on that bill, I'm proud to say that Columbia now, without 1 cent of cost to our taxpayers in this community, Columbia is eligible to receive $1.5 million every year in grants from projects in St. Louis and Kansas City for downtown economic development. We got it in there, we did our job. Now, with respect to historic preservation tax credits, we've mentioned it earlier, I'm opposed to capping or eliminating that program. If that proposal's on the table, there better be a pretty darn good reason why we're doing it. We've got tough fiscal times that we faced the last 2 years. It doesn't look like they're going to get much better. I think that there may be proposals to cut that program back, and I would hope that it would be an absolute last resort. You look at what Tom Atkins, who's been a wonderful civic leader in this community, look at what Mr. Atkins has done for our downtown. That's an inspiration, and that ought to be, we ought to take that vision out of here as a way to promote downtown economic development in this community.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And next, we have Travis Ballinger.
Well, the core of any city is really, the downtown area, and so it is vital to encourage downtown development and revitalization in an effort to really strengthen, the heart of the community. So whether it's going to be Ashland or Hartsburg or Rocheport or Columbia, I'm going to support the downtown development and revitalization efforts. In regards to your second question, I would oppose, efforts to eliminate the historic preservation tax credit. I feel that historic preservation is good policy for creating viable downtown areas in which small businesses can thrive. I know that I think it was the Strollway Center on 9th Street provides an example of a historic preservation effort. And so investing in downtown areas, we can strengthen our communities and our business climate. And so I support historic preservation of unique downtown areas as a means of economic stimulus and also community development.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next, we'll hear from Bob Northup.
In the legislature, I would do what I could to help Columbia and Boone County to protect the greenfield and encourage development in downtown and other central areas. For Columbia, it is in the city's interest and all of our interests to encourage development centrally, of course. Looked at with a case-by-case scrutiny, I would support financial incentives, some sort of tax credits perhaps, or whatever else is fair, and would work to achieve an equitable reward to offset the cost for business and others who are willing to develop centrally. In regards to the historic tax credit, that in principle, I would have to look at, something has to be done where each one of those situations can be looked at individually. In some cases, I might be be in favor of capping some of these, but I would have to look at whatever change in the law is being suggested before I would make a decision on any specific proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And next, we'll hear from Judy Baker.
A downtown area defines a community in a lot of ways, and often when new people coming through or thinking about relocating will judge a community by how they've handled their downtown. We have some significant problems in that we're landlocked with our roads and that kind of thing. If we want to develop downtown, it's going to take a serious plan to do so. And I'd like to see that happen, because I think that we can increase tourism and that kind of thing with the historical preservation. I would be opposed to capping or limiting our ability to offer tax credits for preserving our history. I think that produces community pride and can produce tourism and when our children come back to visit us, we want them to remember what things were like here. That's a very important thing for our kids to be able to look back and see what our history was and why we are proud of who we are.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And next, we have Chuck Graham.
I think first of all, we need to restructure our TIF laws. There are problems with that. You know, when St. Charles County TIFs box stores to build in farmland, that's not a blighted area to me. That's productive farmland, and that is not a blighted area. And that's a misuse of our TIF laws, as much as Jeff mentioned in the plaza in Kansas City, where they used TIF laws to be able to build a law firm. Obviously, it wasn't blighted. Now, maybe after lawyers moved in, people considered it to be blighted. I'm sorry, Jeff. It's your birthday tomorrow. I had to get a lawyer joke in there. But I think that we need to continue to support our historic tax credits, and I'm glad Jeff brought up what Tom Atkins did with the Starway Center. And it's not just important for downtown development, but it's important for a lot of people. As someone who uses a wheelchair, almost every store that was on that block was someplace that was difficult, if not impossible, for me as a person with a disability to be a consumer of and to enjoy. And to be able to go in there, to be able to use an elevator, to go to Cherry Street Artisan, is wonderful for me. And I really appreciate not only the efforts of Tom Atkins and what he did with that, but it's a shining example of what we should be doing with our older downtowns to make them viable economically and from an accessibility standpoint for the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next, we'll take another question from the audience, if anybody has one. If not, I'll go with another prepared question here. And I guess this one will begin with Jeff Harris. And the question is, rapid growth generates huge costs for public infrastructure. In order to meet the needs for the increasing population, business, commercial, and industrial activities, how much of the public infrastructure costs do you feel should be paid by those who have generated these needs? Mr. Harris.
Well, when we look at the wording of the question, I mean, let's bear in mind, developers do already pay costs for the infrastructure of residential subdivisions. They pay for the streets, they pay for the sidewalks, they pay for other things there. So to look at the situation accurately, developers are already bearing some of those infrastructure costs. Now, when we say how much of the public infrastructure costs should be paid for by those who have generated these needs, frankly, the market controls. And when we talk about who's generating these needs, there are folks who are buying houses in areas that are a little bit further out from the services that are being provided. So we have to be honest with ourselves that the market controls here, and we just can't simply say, well, it's not good, and it's for a developer to build outside where services are. What we do have to do, though, is recognize that the further away that we build and we develop from our current existing infrastructure, fire, police, schools, there are additional costs that have to be borne by the community. But I don't think it's accurate to say that one side or the other is completely responsible for those additional stresses on the infrastructure. As much as anything, it's a recognition that we need to have as a society, that the further away we build and the more we develop away from existing infrastructure, the more costs there will be to support that far-flung infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And next, we'll hear from Travis Ballinger.
Well, sprawl is expensive. I think more and more people are understanding that now. And so I read a report before I came over here, and it said that it costs an estimated $90 per linear foot to lay water pipe. And so new development, it creates, not only demand for utilities and roads, but also for schools and police and emergency services. So I think it's important also to, when we look at infrastructure costs, that we not only look at the short term, but we also look at the long term. In the short term, the cost is, of course, enormous. But over time, looking at the long term, the development does create a tax base that will eventually pay for the infrastructure. But for the short term, keeping up with the added infrastructure costs can be a real burden. And so that's why I think it's important to encourage more compact urban growth and redevelop areas inside the city that are not being used.
Thank you, Mr. Ballinger. Next, we'll hear from Bob Northup.
Of course, this problem is being faced every day with all that's going on in Columbia, the Phillips property, Bass Pro, and all the new subdivisions, etc. My position in general is that if developers want to do these things, then they should share or cover the cost of the needed improvements in infrastructure. But if it's going to happen, I believe that the government entities should not drop the other shoe on them after they've made their investments in property and begun their development. RIM put in that whole intersection, I don't know if you know it, out there at I-70 at exit 131, and MoDOT didn't drop that on them until they were well into that development. I'm opposed to that sort of thing. In my 25 years of involvement in public affairs in Columbia and Boone County, I've always been an advocate for those within our community who have to struggle just to live and raise their families. And when the thing that only other thing we could do is to do those TDDs and our special tax districts, and that's a regressive thing and nicks away at the average and low income families who already struggle just to make ends meet to survive.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. Next, we have Judy Baker.
I agree with my colleagues up here. I don't have a whole lot more to add, except that I would like to see us concentrate more on some compact growth as our vision for growth. The lowest per square foot or square mile or square acre or whatever growth that you can have, the least expensive is compact. And so to even keep these costs down and to keep us from having too much sprawl, if we can look at having compact and conservation subdivisions and urban growth, I think that'd be a good way to go.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. And next, we'll hear from Chuck Graham.
A whole lot of this really is a local issue that's going to be decided by people like our county commissioner, Skip Elkin, that are here, or the city council people. However, there are some impact issues from the state, especially in terms of road development and what we're doing. One of the things that bothers me is it seems like our local governments will approve all these developments without the roads necessarily being widened to the point that they can support those developments. Scott Boulevard's a great example. Try making a left turn off Gillespie Bridge Road most of the time. You can't do it. And part of that's MoDOT's problem, because they wait till the car count's high enough before they're going to approve that road being widened. And we've got a big chicken and egg situation. I think we need to have better planning with MoDOT where they sit down with our local government officials, and before we put all those neighborhoods out on a state road, and almost every major thoroughfare in this community is a state road, except for maybe Forum and a couple others. Almost everything else in this community is a state road. And so I think we need to have some better planning, and that goes both ways, between local governments and MoDOT, and also with MoDOT and the local governments, so that we grow in a better manner than the way we've been doing.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next, we have Dan Fischbach.
This question is about as impossible to answer as what's fair. It's a question of whose ox is being gored. Historically, I believe it's a historical fact that generally the city puts in the mains and the developer hooks up to the mains. And that's just the way it's been for so long. What is pushing the need to change this, I can't say specifically. It is becoming very, very expensive to put in all the wastewater handling and the stormwater handling facilities, it's very expensive, but you have to also realize that this growth does increase the tax base. This growth provides customers for all of the businesses here locally, and that's all part of a thriving economy. And bottom line is, yeah, it's a local issue. Y'all are going to have to wrestle with it. I don't see any magic solution coming out of Jefferson City on this one, but I am confident that it will be studied. There are very intelligent people here in Columbia and a lot of very civic-minded people, and I'm sure in the long run the right decisions will be made.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And if anybody in the audience has thought of a question between the time that we ask this one, somebody can come forward. Did you have another question, Alice? I'd give somebody else a chance, but since nobody's raised their hand, go ahead. And Travis Ballinger will be the first one to answer this question.
When I first moved to Missouri over 20 years ago, I went by train through Kansas City when we actually had a big train station there, and there was a sign about 500 trains a day went through here in 1910 or whatever. I think recently, after 9/11, a lot of us were talking about trains across this country. Wouldn't that be nice? Yet we're having a hard time keeping one train a day going between Kansas City and St. Louis. What avenues do you feel like the state of Missouri and representing Boone County in the middle of those two big cities, could you envision to bring mass transit, perhaps like trains, perhaps buses, to Missouri? Thank you.
I think, for my own, I think that, Amtrak has had problems getting people, ridership and everything like that, and it's such a shame because it's such a valuable asset that we do have. And so, I don't know that I have the one magic solution to be able to answer that question, but I think that if we could encourage more people to definitely ride the train, I think that that would alleviate some of that pressure off of I-70. We all know that it's no fun to drive on I-70, and so we need to do something. And I could definitely see myself supporting mass transit, something like that, encouraging more ridership on Amtrak. So I think that's a great question, and I think that it needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Travis Ballinger. And next we have Bob Northup.
I just felt it was a tragedy when we started taking up all the tracks and destroying our train base. We were putting so much pressure on these highways that are so expensive to maintain with the big trucks. The base for I-70 was never made for those. One of those big trucks does as much damage, I understand, as 40,000 cars going over it. And so not only for passenger transit, but also for freight. Somehow we have to, I would favor and want to see a development. Maybe those elevated things that, anything to take the pressure off of our interstate systems, not only in Missouri. It needs to be done all over the country, but I-70 is just, it's just so sad that that's happening there.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. And next we have Judy Baker.
I have a train story. When my first daughter was 14, we took a train trip we left from Jefferson City and went to Chicago for spring break, and it was a great opportunity for her, and it was a wonderful trip. It's very relaxed, and so on. I have a lot of great feelings about trains. However, I do think it's probably a market question. The trains are having trouble because people don't choose to go on the trains very much. We've become a very independent society, and people want to go where they want to go, when they want to go, and not on someone else's schedule or stop at other people's stops and so on. So for getting from place to place, long distances, perhaps it's not very feasible. But I would like to see what mass transit we can do in our population centers to start with. When I lived in New York and Atlanta and so on, I loved riding the mass transit there. It was relaxing. And I think that it could be a very good thing for at least larger communities in Missouri to start with and then expand from there. I think that the state should start looking at those things. We're starting to get the population basis that we need to put those kinds of things into practice.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Next, we have Chuck Graham.
First of all, I've consistently voted to support the subsidy that the state provides to Amtrak. I think that it's important that we keep those rail lines open so that we can have travel across the country, and especially for people with disabilities and those people who don't drive to be able to travel and get out of town. It's difficult for many people if they're not able to drive themselves to be able to have that sort of transportation. And I think it's important that they be able to get from St. Louis to Kansas City to the state capitol to be able to voice their concerns with state government. There are a lot of times when we have rallies and meetings that start at 10:30 because that's when the train is coming in. And when we were trying to stop the Medicaid cuts that the House was involved with last year, we started those at 10:30 or 11 so that people with disabilities could travel and get in there. Part of the problem, and the Jeff City Chamber of Commerce won't like hearing, is not anybody really wants to go to Jeff City. If the train ran through Columbia, I think you would have a lot of students that lived in the cities that would come to Columbia, a lot of people who would come in for games, and a lot of people from here that would travel and go to games. So I guess the tracks just aren't in the right place. Also, you know, I support our local transit system. I don't know why it doesn't work any better. I lived in Springfield, Illinois, and Champaign, Illinois. They have fantastic, accessible mass transit systems in communities of a similar size, and they work very well. I don't know if it's the amount of times they switch routes, or they don't have the right routes running, or they're not making sure that they're running second shifts for working people to be able to get to where they work. But, you know, that's not anything we'll be able to control from the legislature, but certainly something I have a concern with.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next, we have Dan Fishbach.
Well, trains are economically not feasible unless you have a significant density population. I am familiar with a city that put in a local rail transit system. It was Portland, Oregon. I was there when they killed the highway that they really needed and put in the train. It would have been great if all the people who could have ridden the train rode the train, but ridership never met 1/3 of the projected ridership. And to this day, I think they're paying $233 a year per person in taxes for a system that's not used. Now, if you want to pass that tax locally, make sure that you sell it as such, and if enough people vote for it, I guess that's okay. Mass transit is very difficult in a community the size of Portland, size of Columbia. It just is. And unfortunately, like Judy said, we're also independent. And we want to go now, and we're very impatient. And until we change some of those attitudes, I don't see ridership sufficient to see any really significant improvement or enlargement of the public transit system. That's just the facts.
Thank you, Mr. Fishbach. And next, we have Jeff Harris.
Alice, you're probably not going to like my answer to this question, but I'm going to shoot straight with you anyway. I voted against the House bill this year. I think it's House Bill 1008 or 1009. That gave a state subsidy of $8 million to Amtrak. When we're in a time of increasing college tuition, in a time when we're cutting people off health care, in a time when vital services are not being provided in the state of Missouri, I could not in good conscience justify giving $8 million to an enterprise that has never successfully stood on its own. And I feel pretty strongly about that. Now, ideally, I'd love to support mass transit. Right now, I don't think we have the funds for it. I don't think Amtrak is going to be successful. Our highways aren't getting any better, but the fact of the matter is this isn't Western Europe. We're a culture that has become dependent on the automobile. Maybe that can change, but I can't justify putting $8 million a year subsidizing what more and more looks like a dinosaur. I can't look a college student in the eye and say, I gave $8 million to Amtrak, but your college tuition's going up.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And this will be the final question here, and I suspect since we didn't give concluding statements, I suspect as candidates often do on the final question, they might sneak those in there anyways. I guess if that's your choice to do that, you have 90 seconds to answer the question and get in your final sound bite. So the final question, and it'll be directed to Bob Northup first, is Columbia has a mechanism, development fees, for recovering a small amount of public infrastructure costs. Here it's about 8% is the fee. Boone County has no such mechanism. How would you propose to rectify these problems, Mr. Northup?
Well, first of all, I feel that if a developer is making the money that the developer should pay, certainly there seems to be an inequity when compensation to Columbia and the county is not equal, but that's, I think it's something that's got to be worked out here on a local level. I don't know I don't see anything blocking that in the state, but maybe there may be something. I feel the answer is that if either local government is improving the infrastructure to accommodate for new development, then certainly some sort of development tax should be levied. However, I think that 4% is a pittance, and I would ask why shouldn't those causing the need for public infrastructure improvement foot a larger percentage of that needed improvement. I would like to say that what I was trying to answer on the train issue is that I'm just really sad that the freight is gone. The ability to take the freight off of the pressure of the highways is gone. And, if we decide to slow down and not to subsidize Amtrak, put some freight trains on that thing, we're getting some good use of those rails. My big issue in my campaign is to not let the I-70 through Columbia be expanded to increase the pollution. I propose, again, a northern loop about 5 miles north where it won't dump all of that pollution back into the bowl we're living in. And so that's one of my little hobby horses I'm working on right now.
Thank you, Mr. Northup. Next, we have Judy Baker.
I would, I have to get back to the question here. Repeat the question for me, please.
Yeah, the question was,
The mechanism, the 8%. It would probably appear that a level playing field either way would be good. It's more a county issue, though. I don't know that there's much at the state level we can do about it. And so we'll leave that up for the county planners to decide what they need, but it sounds to me like a level playing field would be good for county to be able to fund their land development as easily or at the same level as the city's able to. And as one of the things I'd like to add just to the discussion, at the state level, perhaps some things we can do to address a lot of the things we've talked about here tonight would be to offer some programs like we have for farmers. The state has several educational programs for farmers to help them in their planning and development and in their commerce and how they run their businesses and so on through extension and other things, research and so on. We help farmers. When it comes to developers, we don't have any such mechanisms of education, offered economic development seminars or smart planning seminars or that kind of thing that the state could perhaps through certain departments or so on provide for communities and developers ways to meet regulations that are imposed upon them that will make things am I out of time already? Just to meet the regulations in a smart way, in an inexpensive way.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Next, we have Chuck Graham.
As far as I know, and Skip can correct me if I'm wrong, the county has the authority to be able to pass on those fees if they want to with developers. And if they don't, as he shakes his head no, and you can't hear that at home, we could certainly have an amendment or legislation to give them the authority to do so, and then it's up to them to decide whether that's what they want to do. At the end of the day, the cost gets passed on to everyone. We're all going to pay for it, whether it's in taxes or purchase of goods or anything else. But it's certainly something that will need the guidance of the county commission on, because I don't certainly want to step on their toes. That's one of the problems with them not having home rules. They've got to get our permission to do any of these sorts of things. Boone County's going to grow. We know that it's going to grow. The challenge and the question for all of us is how do we make sure it grows right? How do we make sure that we've got the wastewater treatment facilities, the infrastructure, the sewer, so that we grow in a way that is environmentally responsible, economically responsible, and keeps us the great community we live in. Even with the growth and the struggles that we have, keep in mind a lot of sales tax revenue comes in this community, and that sales tax revenue is what helps us buy Stevens Lake Park and expand our trail systems and add to the parkland and the quality of life that we have here in Columbia. So we can't just hate business. because they bring in a lot of the revenue that helps us afford the quality of life that we have here and what makes Boone County great. And I'd like to thank you for having us all here this evening and having an open conversation with all of us as we prepare for the November 2nd election. And I just encourage everyone to get out and vote.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. And next we have Dan Fischbach.
Yes, I certainly would support any required legislation to do whatever the county commission felt was necessary in the interest of Boone County to offset part of the cost of infrastructure development. That would be up to the commissioners to decide, and if you needed to put it up to a vote first to see what people wanted to do on that, but if you all decided you wanted that, I would certainly support that legislation. I think leveling the playing field between development costs in the county and the city might be a good thing, but on the other hand, that might encourage more sprawl if it gets if we take some of that money from the developers. Maybe that'll encourage sprawl, so maybe it's not a good idea. We'll have to flesh that out. In conclusion, it's very easy to sit up in here and say, I'm in favor of this, I'm in favor of that, I'm in favor of that. And so many of these causes are right, justifiable, and important. But fiscal reality is, I don't see any pent-up emotion for increasing taxes. The good news is, I understand that general revenue increased 7% this year. We are out of the slump. We've rounded the corner. The economy is improving. Tax revenues will continue to grow, and within reason, we should be able to support things of importance to all the people here in Boone County. And I would certainly evaluate every issue brought based on its merit and weigh it against the other concerns, and hopefully make the right decisions for responsible use of your tax dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fischbach. And next we have Jeff Harris.
Well, I want to thank the Boone County Smart Growth Coalition. I want to thank KOPN. I want to thank Public Access TV and those folks here this evening and watching and listening at home for what I think has been a productive and informative discussion of important issues that affect the lives of everyone here in central Missouri. With respect to this particular question, this is one of those issues, like so many that we face, where we in the legislature, the local delegation, will sit down and visit with our local county commissioners and work to arrive at what we believe is a good conclusion. The larger issue, though, I think that we've addressed this evening and we need to be continually mindful of, is how we balance economic growth with preserving quality of life. Those are the things that the Growth in the Heartland report addressed. As we look at exurban and suburban communities across this state, it's going to be a real challenge for us in the legislature in Jefferson City to balance those sometimes competing interests. I think they can be balanced. I will work to balance those interests and make sure that we preserve the quality of life that we all enjoy here in Columbia that makes us one of the most livable cities in this country. I thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my views with you here this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And finally, we have Travis Ballinger.
Well, I would be willing to support legislation to allow Boone County commissioners to be able to take on that issue. I think that's real important. I was recently appointed to the Boone County Building Code Commission, and we had a meeting last night, and we agreed that it would be better if Boone County had the same building codes as Columbia. I think developers would support this because they wouldn't have to deal with the bureaucracy of dealing with two different sets of codes. I think a more level playing field between the city and the county would also create incentives for developers to build closer to the existing infrastructure, and so I think that's important. I'd just again like to say thank you for inviting us, and thanks everybody for coming. It was a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to visiting with anyone after the forum.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank KOPN for broadcasting this on public access television, and the Smart Growth Coalition for putting it on, as well as the Commission for letting us use these chambers. And especially I want everyone to give a hand to these 6 candidates and to make sure you vote in November. All of them have good interest. Thanks again all for coming.